The Emhart is a high-security 6-pin tumbler lock which was initially patented in 1978 by Leo Raskevicius and then modified with a secondary patent by Walter Serco Jr. Its key pins must be both lifted and rotated for the lock to open. This is accomplished by a key pin with a V-shaped bottom known as a chisel point. The chisel point of the key pins interact with angled cuts in the key, causing it to rotate to one of two rotational positions, 20 degrees and negative 20 degrees. Emhart labels these rotations left and right. The pin is also lifted to one of 5 heights, which are labeled 2 through 6. The number 1 cut is not present, as not enough of a groove can be formed at this height to reliably rotate the pin. If this introduction sounds similar to my Medico video, it is probably because it is very similar. So much so that Medico sued Emhart over patent infringement, which greatly limited the production of this fantastic lock. But this is where the similarities between these two locking mechanisms stop. The Emhart key pins and drivers interlock like a sliding dovetail joint. When the pins are rotated so that these joints align with the axis of rotation of the plug, the key pin and the drivers will unlock and slide apart. In this cutaway of the Emhart, we can see two things happening as we insert the key. The sliding dovetail joint is lifted to the shear line, and the pins are also rotated so that the joint is in line with the axis of plug rotation. Let's take a closer look at those pins. This is a left key pin and a right key pin. They can easily be differentiated by a groove located on the top of the left key pin. If we take a look at these key pins from the top, we see the slot of the dovetail joint and both key pins look the same. However, the chisel tip, overlaid in yellow, of a left key pin will be oriented 20 degrees relative to the slot, and the chisel tip of a right key pin will be oriented minus 20 degrees relative to the slot. Each of these rotational types has 5 heights, which make for 10 unique key pins. There are also 2 driver lengths. Key pin 2, 3, and 4 have a longer driver, and key pins 5 and 6 the shorter driver. Now that we've reviewed all the pins, let's take a look at how this lock is picked. It would be near impossible to make a definitive picking guide for the Emhart. Why? Because the picking technique is highly dependent on the keyway, and the Emhart has many keyways. The goal of this section is to look at some generalizable tips for picking the Emhart and examining my preferred technique for the L and D keyways, using the L2 keyway as an example. This is a top view of the Emhart key pin sitting in the plug of the lock without its interlocking driver. It has no rotation limiter and is free to spin 360 degrees. When the slot of the dovetail is in line with the short axis of the plug, the key pin is in the correct orientation for the lock to open. This occurs when the chisel tip overlaid in yellow of a left key pin is rotated 20 degrees, or the chisel tip of a right pin is rotated minus 20 degrees. This correct orientation occurs for a given pin with every 180 degrees of rotation. If the key pin is 90 degrees off of this orientation, with the slot of the dovetail in line with the long axis of the plug, you may enter the false set of doom. This happens when the chisel tip of a left key pin is in the 110 degree position, or the chisel tip of a right key pin is in the minus 110 degree position. The most important concept in picking the Emhart is the avoidance of the false set of doom. Let's take a closer look at this phenomenon and why it occurs with an anterior cross-section. When the joint is in the correct orientation, the pins will unlink and the plug will be able to rotate. When the joint is rotated 90 degrees off from the correct orientation, the lateral play of the dovetail joint will allow the plug to slightly rotate. This will lock the pins in this orientation by placing tension and stretching out the joint. This false set makes rotating the pins to the correct orientation impossible, unless you manually rotate out of the false set and relieve the stress on the joint. This increases your chance of dropping set pins. The false set of doom occurs when all the pins are at shear and one or more pins are in this incorrect rotational position. Let's try and further analyze this and see how it may be avoided. If we imagine looking at the top of an unknown pin, there are two positions of the chisel tip, shown in yellow, which may lead to an open, 20 degrees and minus 20 degrees. There are also two positions of the chisel tip that may lead to an irrecoverable configuration, 110 degrees and minus 110 degrees. So in general, the green section would represent safe rotational positions, and the red, theoretically less safe rotational positions. With this concept in mind, it would be ideal to know the starting position of every pin and have the ability to manipulate them in a way to avoid these undesirable rotational positions. Let's take a look and see how this may be accomplished in the L2 keyway. The first step would be having a consistent starting orientation for all the pins. This may be accomplished by zipping the pins. The angle, placement, pick type, and keyway will all affect the final rotation of the pins, so you need to experiment to see what works for you. By zipping the pins from the bottom of the L2 keyway with a Peterson 7, they all end up in approximately the 35-degree rotational position. This is a fantastic starting point. Step 2 would be manipulating the pins in a reliable and reproducible fashion. Let's see how this is accomplished in this split screen view with a close-up of the front of the lock in the left panel and a wider view on the right panel. To pick the left pins to 20 degrees, you get behind the right side of the pin, twist the pick behind the pin to rotate it as you ride the right ramp of the warding. Once you are behind the left side, you lift and pull towards you. Let's zip those pins back to 35 degrees and do this maneuver again to show that it's reproducible. To pick the right pins to negative 20 degrees, the pick is placed on the bottom of the keyway and you simply get behind the right side of the pin and lift while pulling it slightly towards you. Let's zip those pins to get them back to the resting 35-degree configuration and try again. Different techniques may need to be implemented with different keyways, and some keyways may be so paracentric that no technique would allow for reproducible or reliable results. Another important concept is being able to differentiate a set pin from an unset pin. This is where the click test comes into play. Set pins will give a distinctive click sound as the pick is quickly flicked across them. There is also a distinctive tactile feedback which is difficult to describe but feels like looseness when the pin is flicked. Bound unset pins do not produce the sound and feel firm when flicked. If the pin feels bound because the rotation is not quite right, it is best to pull the pin from the back to fine-tune their rotation. And that pin is set. The last important concept I want to review is making sure to set each pin both the shear and rotationally before proceeding to the next pin. Each pin set at the shear line causes a slightly deeper false set, which in turn increases the difficulty of rotating the next pin. If all the pins are set to shear initially, it would be very difficult to rotate them all. This is in stark contrast to medical locks, in which you set everything to shear, then rotate, or vice versa. Alright, let's get to picking. Okay, so I'm going to insert the key and rotate it back and forth a couple of times to ensure that all the key pins and drivers are properly interlocked. It's customary then to rake the pins to randomize their orientation. However, as you now know, the controlled zip can realign them to your preferred starting orientation. Pin 5 is a low lift right pin and is set from the bottom of the keyway and now passes the click test. That's pin 4, and now it's passing the click test. Pin 3 is a left pin, and I don't think I'm getting the correct angle on it. I'm going to come right back to it. I'm going to pin 6, and it feels like it doesn't quite want to be set. 5 is clicky. 4 is clicky. Now with pin 3, I'm curving behind the pin with the pick properly aligned using the peripheral right warding as a fulcrum. And now it passes the click test. I'm going back to 6, which is also a left pin, and now it feels like it is setting correctly. Pin 6 is clicky. 5 is clicky. 4 is clicky. And now 3 is clicky. That's pin 2, a mid-lift right pin, and now it passes the click test. I have found it easier to switch to a bottom of the keyway tensioner for pin number 1, which is a left pin, as it allows me to get my pick in the proper orientation and easily hook around the pin. That click signifies that pin 1 is at shear, but is not properly oriented yet or the lock would have opened. I find that it's always that last pin which gives me the most difficulty in setting its rotational position. This is because all the other pins are set, and this pin gets the most binding tension. The best way to rotationally set a pin, which is already at the shear line, is by pulling it from behind in the direction that you want it to rotate in. Pushing a pin to set its rotation is much less controlled. Just checking on pin 2 again, it's passing the clicky test. Now back to 1, pulling it from behind. Gonna pulse on tension a little bit to release some of this tension and to help me rotate this pin. But it doesn't seem to be working. I just keep pulling it from behind, trying to coax it into the correct orientation. Come on. And we're open. Nice. All right, let's get this guy out of the vise. I'm going to lock it back up, insert the key to relink all the key pins and drivers. Now I'm going to pull all the pins out the top. The Emhart is an absolutely fantastic lock, which is super difficult to pick, significantly harder than a Medeco. It's quite ironic that Emhart and Medeco are now owned by the same parent company, ASSA ABLOY. The ingenious part was that the Emhart could be integrated into larger pre-existing systems as a high security option, as it shared many common keyways with Russwin and Corbin, such as the L, D, H, 59, 60, and 70. There were about 66 keyways in total. It's a real shame that its production was so limited. Let's take the cam off the back so we can take a better look at the plug. So the plug of the Emhart has these concentric grooves around the pin chambers, which act as a guide for the driver pins. It keeps their end of the dovetail joint in the correct orientation when the lock is unlocked and the plug is rotated. This is the same reason that the key has its characteristic cutouts on the bottom, which is to allow passage of the driver pins when the plug is rotated past the bottom of the keyway. Finally, here's a close-up of all the key pins and driver pins. I'm really glad that I had an opportunity to share one of my favorite locks with you. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and perhaps learned something new. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the next video.